New York City, 1777. The air itself felt heavy, not with the clean brine of the harbor, but with the cloying scent of British occupation. It was a city transformed into a gilded cage, a Tory stronghold where the scarlet uniforms of the King's men were as ubiquitous as the cobbled streets beneath their polished boots. Since General William Howe had driven George Washington's ragged Continental Army out of the city the year before, Manhattan had become the strategic nerve center of the Crown's North American ambitions. This was not the gritty, defiant city of Boston, but a thriving yet corrupted port, where loyalist refugees mixed with wealthy merchants and an endless stream of bored, arrogant British officers. Martial law hung over the docks and taverns like a pall, yet inside the grander houses and fashionable shops, a decadent wartime economy thrived. The city was a place of dangerous extremes. Luxury existed beside lethal destitution, and the fear of the infamous prison ships, floating hells in the harbor, was a constant chilling reminder of the consequences of dissent. Within this cage, at a finely appointed storefront on Lower Queen Street, now Pearl Street, operated Hercules Mulligan, a man whose entire existence was a calculated, dazzling piece of misdirection. The fashionable mask. Mulligan was an Irish-born immigrant, a robust, charismatic man who had built his reputation as one of the city's preeminent custom tailors and clothiers. His shop catered to the absolute crème de la crème of New York society. He handled imported silks, fine woolen broadcloths, and intricate brass buttonry. He measured waistcoats and breeches for the governor and the leading merchants, but his most valuable and most dangerous clientele were the high-ranking officers of the British military, generals, majors, captains of the Royal Navy. To them, Mulligan was a convivial, sometimes overly effusive Irishman, a charming man of business who seemed utterly uninterested in the colonial squabble. He would fuss over a uniform's drape, critique the proper cut of a Hessian colonel's cuff, and offer perfectly pitched, politically neutral gossip, all the while cultivating a reputation as a harmless, slightly opportunist Tory sympathizer. This mask was his salvation. His shop was a haven where officers, secure in their dominance and convinced of their tailor's loyalty, would drop their guard. They would boast of planned movements, complain about supply ship routes, or demand a uniform completed by a specific urgent deadline, all invaluable clues to impending troop movements. Mulligan's treason, however, ran deep. Years before the war, he was one of the first members of the Sons of Liberty, a radical organization committed to undermining the Crown. He was an intimate of Alexander Hamilton, who had lived with him while attending King's College. When Washington and the Continental Army were forced to retreat, it was Hamilton, then serving on Washington's staff, who made the fateful recommendation: Mulligan must stay. He was perfectly positioned to be their eyes and ears, their most critical spy within the belly of the beast. Mulligan accepted the role with a patriot's fervor and a gambler's calculated cool. The mechanics of treason. The work was treacherous. Every snip of the scissors, every conversation was a high-stakes performance. A single slip, a question too pointed, a sudden lack of enthusiasm for the king could land him in the cold darkness of a prison ship, or worse, on the gallows. Mulligan relied on three core principles of espionage. The invisible listener. Officers viewed tailors, like other servants and tradesmen, as non-persons. In their presence, conversations about strategy, troop strength, and morale flowed freely. Mulligan mastered the art of listening intently while appearing utterly absorbed in his measurements. The deadline predictor. The most consistent source of intelligence came from uniform deadlines. If 4 different commanders suddenly demanded the completion of new regimentals or the immediate repair of campaigning gear by the 10th of the month, Mulligan knew with high certainty a major deployment or march was scheduled for the 11th. He was in effect predicting military movements by reading a calendar of tailoring appointments. The unsuspected courier network. Gathering the intelligence was half the battle. Getting it across the Hudson River to Washington's headquarters in New Jersey was the fatal half. Mulligan did not risk his own life on the delivery. For this, he required a messenger, a conduit who could slip through British pickets and checkpoints, a person so utterly disregarded by the occupation forces that they were, in a grim way, completely invisible. The silent partner. Cato. This critical role belonged to Cato, an enslaved African man who was part of the Mulligan household. Cato's existence in the Queen Street establishment was a study in paradox. He was a piece of property, yet possessed an expertise that made him valuable. He was often occupied with the sophisticated, tedious work of preparing and serving the family's chocolate. In the 18th century, chocolate was not merely a drink. It was a high-status commodity, often prepared from raw cacao beans ground, spiced, and mixed with sugar, a complex, time-consuming craft. This task frequently took Cato into the kitchen, the pantries, and sometimes even into the rear parlor where Mulligan received his most important clients. While officers discussed the war over a warm, frothing cup of the dark, rich beverage Cato had prepared, he moved like a shadow, silent, unthreatening, and unseen. They saw a man serving drinks. They did not see a man listening to every word, absorbing every boast, every slip of information that related to their commander-in-chief, George Washington. In the tragic hierarchy of the occupied city, an enslaved person was below suspicion. His presence was a natural part of the loyalist-leaning household. His silence was assumed to be ignorance. This systemic racism and prejudice was the very thing that made Cato the perfect and perhaps the most consequential asset in Washington's entire spy network. He could move through the city, often sent on small errands by Mrs. Mulligan or the tailor himself, crossing paths with the British without raising an eyebrow. Who would suspect a black man fetching supplies or delivering a note was in fact carrying the lifeline of the Revolution? Cato's relationship with Hercules Mulligan was a complex and morally fraught one, rooted in the inherent injustice of slavery, yet bound by the shared, dangerous secret of their patriotic cause. Mulligan, a vocal member of the Sons of Liberty and later a founder of the New York Manumission Society, was himself a man of profound contradictions, a staunch advocate for American freedom who nonetheless owned another man. For Cato, the act of spying was a transaction far more personal than a political ideal. Every secret he helped deliver was a subtle step, he hoped, toward his own ultimate freedom, or at least his survival in a world designed to deny him both. The dual lives in the Queen Street shop were a tightrope walk. Mulligan played the fawning tailor, hiding his revolutionary fervor under a layer of Irish charm and fine broadcloth. Cato played the dutiful servant, hiding his razor-sharp intelligence behind an expression of practiced deference. The stage was set. The city was a powder keg. The officers were arrogant and loose-lipped, and a storm of conspiracy was brewing that would test the courage and loyalty of both the celebrated spy and his unheralded, indispensable courier. The kitchen of Hercules Mulligan's fashionable Queen Street residence was a realm defined by heat, spice, and the complex, musky aroma of cacao. This was Cato's domain, a small enclosed space that was simultaneously a sanctuary and a cell. Outside, the city was a theater of war and high treason. Inside, Cato performed his own silent alchemy. He was a master of the cocoa trade, a skill few enslaved people were afforded, and one that ironically granted him access to the privileged spaces his color and status otherwise forbade. To the British officers and Tory merchants who frequented the tailor shop, Cato was merely an extension of the kitchen, a pair of skilled hands meant to grind, spice, and froth the precious imported ingredients. They saw the end product, the steaming, rich beverage served in delicate porcelain cups, but never the long, strenuous labor behind it. Cato's hands, strong and steady from years of grinding dried cacao beans, were his true tools. The process was ritualistic, roasting the beans over slow heat, painstakingly shelling them, and then grinding the oily nibs into a thick, dark paste, often on a heated stone known as a metate. He incorporated precious spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves, and perhaps a touch of chili powder, all expensive imports meant to signal the wealth and sophistication of the household. This was not the sweetened candy of the future. It was a thick, fortifying liquid served hot and sweetened heavily with sugar, another product of enslaved labor, to appeal to the European palate. It was an essential ritual of polite society, served at the close of fittings, during private meetings, or as a welcome tonic against the damp New York chill. The officers consumed it carelessly, never suspecting that the man who prepared their drink was the most acute intelligence operative in the entire city. The strategic position of the unseen man. Cato's proficiency with chocolate was his strategic advantage, his coat of invisibility. In colonial New York, a servant skilled in such a fine art was given a relative, if deeply limited, measure of trust. When officers retired to Mulligan's small private parlor to discuss payment, or more often to boast of their future campaign plans, the chocolate and tea service had to be nearby and often needed refilling or replenishing. The prevailing view among the officers was that enslaved people were either too simple or too preoccupied with their own misery to absorb complex military intelligence. Cato exploited this prejudice brilliantly. He perfected the art of neutral presence. His face, impassive and focused on his task, revealed nothing. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his eyes downcast, his back often to the main group, yet his ears were finely tuned instruments, sifting the noise of casual conversation for the signal of a secret. Over the months of the occupation, Cato's silent surveillance had furnished Mulligan with dozens of critical pieces of information. He learned of a planned Hessian raid from an officer complaining about the quality of the new boots required for a sudden overland march. He learned of a naval supply shipment from a midshipman grumbling about the exact date his ship was due to sail. These pieces of tattle, passed on through Mulligan's network of couriers, often provided the fractional advance notice that allowed Washington to save vital supplies or reposition troops just in time. Cato was the first filter in the intelligence chain, and his judgment was usually infallible. The fateful, hurried order. The day the critical information arrived was a cold, sharp afternoon, typical of the early spring chill. Major General Sir Henry Clinton was preparing for a major move, an attempt to consolidate British control over key waterways north of the city. Two colonels, known for their aggressive, impetuous natures, rushed into Mulligan's shop. They were not there for a leisurely fitting. They needed a crisis response. One colonel, his face flushed from the cold and some hurried exertion, slapped a sketch on the main counter. "Mulligan, we need these ready by dawn, no excuses. 3 watch coats for the forward scout detail, heavy, dark wool, quickly. And you must not speak a word of this deadline." A watch coat was a thick, heavy outer garment designed for men on sentry duty or scout missions. a garment whose urgency signaled a sudden overnight operation. Mulligan, ever the picture of efficient servility, assured them it would be done, his mind already racing. But it was the second colonel, more relaxed and looking forward to the promised chocolate, who would let slip the truly devastating information. The slip of the tongue. The colonels retreated to the back parlor, eager for a warm drink and a brief rest. Cato, having already prepared the cacao mixture, moved swiftly to the charcoal brazier to heat the beverage to the perfect steaming temperature. He poured the thick chocolate into the cups, careful to keep the clatter of the implement to a minimum, and entered the parlor. As he served the drinks, he heard the first colonel, now completely comfortable, sigh of relief. "Thank God for these watch coats. We need the men protected for the all-night run. If that fox Washington doesn't suspect a thing, this capture operation will be flawless." The second colonel, stirring his drink, lowered his voice conspiratorially, yet loud enough for the small room to carry the words. "Flawless indeed. The general is convinced the new route will take him right through the kill zone near a small, specifically named village that Cato immediately catalogued. We hit him hard, take him alive if possible. The rebellion ends tomorrow if we get him. A swift, clean sweep before breakfast." He took a long, satisfied gulp of the chocolate, seemingly cleansing his palate of the dangerous words he had just spoken. Cato froze, a serving spoon hovering inches above a porcelain cup. The urgency of the secret record he heard hit him with the force of a physical blow. The officers, engrossed in the satisfying taste of the expensive drink and their own bravado, did not notice the briefest rigidity in his shoulders. They had dismissed the man serving them as a thing, a mere piece of furniture that pours. They never imagined the enormity of the intelligence they had just gifted him. The bitter recognition and internal tempest. Cato retreated to the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs, not for fear for his own life, but with the terrifying recognition of absolute imminent disaster. He washed the silver spoons slowly, meticulously, to avoid raising any suspicion from the errand boy or scullery maid who might be nearby. This was not a matter of troops moving north or supplies arriving late. This was the head of the serpent. If Washington were captured or killed, the Continental Army, already brittle and often on the run, would instantly fracture. The fragile alliance of the colonies would collapse. The revolution would fail, swiftly and surely. And if the revolution failed, Cato knew with a clarity born of deep suffering, the hopes for the abolition of slavery, however distant they seemed even with Washington at the helm, would be extinguished for generations. The British had their own complicated relationship with slavery, but a fully restored Crown control meant the permanent entrenchment of the colonial slave system. The weight of the secret was crushing. It was now his and his alone. He had to deliver the intelligence to Mulligan, but even that was a risk. A hasty word, a sudden change in routine. The British officers had informers everywhere. Cato was now not just a listener, he was an actor, thrust onto a deadly stage. He had to calculate every move. When could he approach Mulligan privately? How could the message leave the city without being intercepted? And most terrifyingly, what price would he pay if he failed or if he was discovered? The aroma of the rich chocolate in the air felt sickeningly sweet, a cloying reminder of the hypocrisy of the British occupation. A life of decadent luxury built upon the exploitation and casual cruelty toward the very people who were now, quite literally, holding the fate of the American cause in their hands. Cato wiped down the counter, his mind already formulating the plan, his silent watch now transformed into an immediate life-or-death mission. He knew that before the sun rose tomorrow, General Washington must be warned, and that his own life had just been placed on the most dangerous wager of the entire war.
The message was clear, terrifyingly specific, and demanded immediate action. George Washington was to be ambushed near a small wooded defile just beyond the Hudson tomorrow morning. The Revolution, fragile and indebted, hung by a thread that ran through the heart of occupied New York. Hercules Mulligan found Cato in the washroom, polishing a set of ceremonial spoons. The tailor's hand was heavy on Cato's shoulder, a touch that was part intimacy, part command. "The watch coats, Cato," Mulligan murmured, his eyes darting to the hallway. "They need them for the pre-dawn scout. That kill zone near the Peekskill Road, it's confirmed?" Cato did not look up, his voice a low, disciplined monotone. "Confirmed, master. They spoke of taking him alive before breakfast, tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was dense with the weight of their shared conspiracy. Mulligan was a passionate patriot, a man who risked the hangman's noose daily for the abstract ideal of liberty. Yet standing before him was a man who legally possessed neither liberty nor the right to his own life. The central irony of the American cause, fighting for freedom while holding others in bondage, was never starker than in that cramped, dimly lit washroom. Mulligan understood that his own survival hinged on this message reaching Washington, but he also understood that the person he was about to send into the night, the man whose life he was about to risk, was the only one who could possibly succeed. A white courier, especially a known patriot, would be searched, questioned, and recognized. Cato, the enslaved black man, would be overlooked. His inherent lack of societal status was, in this moment, his greatest shield. "It has to be you, Cato," Mulligan whispered, laying a hand on a small, sealed packet. "This is the intelligence, the date, the location, the regiments involved. It must reach Hamilton's aide or Washington himself by midnight. If it's later, they'll already be in motion." Cato finally met his master's gaze. His acceptance was not framed in patriotic fervor, but in quiet, steely resolve. "I understand the urgency, master. What is my cover?" The disguise of disregard. Mulligan quickly concocted a brilliant, almost insulting cover story. Cato was to take a small basket of spoiled foodstuffs and mending supplies to a distant tenant farm that Mulligan occasionally used outside the main defensive lines. A simple, menial errand requiring an overnight absence. He was to carry a pass, signed by Mulligan, detailing the supplies and granting leave to be abroad during restricted hours. The pass looked official, but its contents, a list of stale bread, a cracked teacup, and a few linen scraps, ensured its carrier would be viewed as an object of low consequence. The real message was tucked into the false lining of the basket, hidden beneath the useless clutter of the supposed errand. As Cato slipped out the back door into the darkening streets, the weight of the moment settled upon him. He was a fugitive within a captured city, carrying a message that held the destiny of a continent. His journey was not a ride on horseback like Paul Revere's. It was a slow, deliberate trudge through the shadows, depending entirely on the apathy and disdain of his oppressors. Through the labyrinths of occupation. The first stage was the hardest, navigating the heart of British-controlled Manhattan. Every corner held a patrol, every tavern a knot of drunken soldiers. Cato maintained a specific defensive posture, head bowed, eyes scanning the ground, pace steady but not hurried. He looked like every other laborer or servant out after curfew, a man whose exhaustion was assumed to be due to his station. He moved through the smells of wood smoke, stagnant sewage, and cheap British rum. He encountered 2 patrols. The first, near the battery, stopped him immediately. A young, cocky ensign, barely 18, shoved him against a wall. "What's your business, boy? Curfew is set." Cato presented the pass, his voice respectful but flat. "Mending supplies and spoiled victuals for the master's tenant farm. Urgent delivery. Master Mulligan, the tailor." The ensign glanced at the pass, then at the basket. The combination of Mulligan's well-known name associated with British officers and the poverty of the cargo was instantly dismissive. The ensign sniffed at the sour smell of the stale bread. "God, what wretched business. Get on with it, and stick to the main roads. Don't want you spooking any horses." The British officer, by his casual disgust, had confirmed Cato's freedom of passage. The second obstacle was the checkpoint at the extreme northern edge of Manhattan, a reinforced position guarding the ferry crossings. This time, the guard was a hardened, cynical sergeant. This man was more thorough, peering into the basket. He noted the meager contents and, after a brief, demeaning pat-down, merely grunted. "Move along. If you're caught north of the lines before dawn, you're on your own." The very lack of suspicion was deafening. No British soldier could conceive of the enslaved courier as a patriot. He was simply a piece of Mulligan's property performing a routine, ignoble task. This profound oversight, born of deep-seated racial prejudice, was the ultimate flaw in the British security apparatus. The treacherous crossing. Reaching the Hudson River was only the halfway point. The river was a chaotic ribbon of water, choked with Royal Navy patrol boats and dotted with the silhouettes of the notorious prison ships. Crossing it was a death warrant for any unauthorized person. Cato used a contact established months earlier, an aging fisherman who lived in a shack near the ferry slip, a man paid in small amounts of silver and favors for his occasional blindness. He found the man cleaning his nets by the sickly light of a low-burning lamp. "Urgent crossing," Cato said, his voice clipped. "General's life, tonight." The fisherman, recognizing the gravity in Cato's eyes he had rarely seen express such open urgency, did not haggle. He pointed to a small, worn rowboat hidden beneath a mound of canvas. "The tide is turning fast. You'll have a hard push to get across the current, and the Viper Patrol is active tonight. Stay low, stay out of the center channel." The journey across the dark, swirling water of the Hudson River was a physical and psychological trial. Cato rowed with the desperate strength of a man carrying the fate of a nation. The current fought him, the biting spray soaked him, and the near-constant sound of distant musket fire reminded him of the absolute peril. At one point, the dark shape of a Royal Navy pinnace, a fast patrol boat, swept past, its officers oblivious to the small shadow hugging the riverbank. Cato froze, clinging to the oars, his breath held tight in his chest. Had they seen him, he would have been shot immediately, his message sinking with him to the icy bottom. He was an enslaved man, risking death for the chance to save the master of the very army that held his master in bondage. The irony was a cold, bitter taste in his mouth, colder than the river water. The rendezvous and the relief. Cato finally beached the boat on the Jersey shore, his body trembling from cold and effort. He ran inland, following a rough, hidden path that led toward the rumored location of Washington's headquarters near Morristown. He discarded the basket and the worthless pass. His identity as a simple, errand-running slave was over for the night. He was now a runner of high intelligence.
He found the Continental Army's outer picket line just after 11 p.m. The American sentries were exhausted, suspicious, and poorly equipped. They quickly apprehended him, shoving him roughly against a tree, their muskets leveled. "Who are you? You're black, coming from the British side. A spy, eh?" one demanded. "I have an urgent, vital message for Colonel Alexander Hamilton, or General Washington himself," Cato gasped, his voice regaining its authority despite his ragged state. "I am from Mulligan's shop in New York. The general is in danger. A morning ambush." The sentries were skeptical, but the mention of Mulligan, a known source, and the sheer urgency in the man's eyes convinced them to take him to their commanding officer. After a fraught 10 minutes of questioning, he was led directly to the small, cold house serving as the general's temporary headquarters. There, he was met not by Washington, but by the young, intense Colonel Hamilton, Hercules Mulligan's old friend. Hamilton took one look at the exhausted, mud-caked man and the seal on the message he held, and his face instantly drained of color. He knew Mulligan's methods. He knew the risk involved. Cato, his mission complete, watched as Hamilton broke the seal and quickly read the detailed account of the ambush plot. The young colonel's eyes widened, his jaw set. He immediately turned and bolted up the stairs to Washington's private quarters, the paper clutched in his hand. Cato stood in the cold parlor, soaked, exhausted, but alive. He had done what no white patriot could have done. He had slipped through the net of prejudice and war, using his very subjugation as a cloak, and delivered the single piece of intelligence that would save the commander-in-chief and the revolution itself just hours before the dawn. The scene inside the humble farmhouse serving as General George Washington's headquarters near Morristown was one of controlled chaos. The hour was late, well past midnight, and the air was thick with the smell of lamp oil and urgency. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, having burst into the general's private quarters, stood breathless before a rapidly wakening Washington. The general, an imposing figure even in disheveled sleepwear, listened intently as Hamilton relayed the vital intelligence. He glanced at the sealed packet Cato had delivered, the terse coded message from Hercules Mulligan that confirmed the assassination/capture plot. The details were chillingly precise: the time, the location near the Peekskill Road, the names of the regiments tasked with the ambush, and the specific British officers involved. "The intelligence is solid, General," Hamilton insisted, his voice tight. "Mulligan is meticulous, and the courier, a man named Cato, he traveled from New York tonight under cover of a slave's errand. The risk he took verifies the urgency." Washington's face, usually a mask of stoic resolve, betrayed a flicker of grim realization. He had faced bullets and cannon fire, but this was the dark, insidious threat of betrayal and ambush. The loss of the commander-in-chief, the single figure holding the disparate Continental forces together, would have meant the instant decapitation of the revolution. Retreating after the failure to hold New York had already strained morale. His capture now would be the final, fatal blow. "The plan stands for the morning?" Washington asked, his voice low but steady. "The route is set for the road they mentioned, sir. We must alter the entire column's movement immediately." The next few hours were a whirlwind of quiet, high-stakes decision-making. No bugle calls, no unnecessary noise. The British had informers everywhere, even in the surrounding countryside. Washington, Hamilton, and a handful of trusted aides worked silently, redirecting couriers to the various regiments. The entire column's rendezvous point was changed, and a new, circuitous, and safer route was plotted under the secrecy of lantern light. The decoy and the delay. To ensure the British acted on the original information, Washington ordered a brilliant and risky countermeasure. He did not simply reroute the main body of troops. Rather, he designated a small contingent of wagons and a few mounted riders, enough to suggest a forward advance party, to travel briefly on the original road near the kill zone, timing their movement to be slightly later than the original schedule. The primary objective was twofold: confirmation and misdirection. The decoy would confirm to any lingering British scouts that the plan was still in motion, and the delay would ensure Washington himself was nowhere near the ambush site when the trap was sprung. As the pre-dawn hours bled into the false light of early morning, Washington's main column began its silent southward march on the revised route. The air was frigid, the ground unforgiving, but the stealth and discipline were absolute. The general rode near the head of the column, his eyes constantly scanning the tree lines, acutely aware of how close they had come to disaster. The immediate safety was paramount, but the intelligence from Cato allowed for one more action: identifying the source of the leak. Mulligan's note contained a description of one of the chief conspirators, a loyalist officer known to be stationed near the headquarters. Working quickly, Hamilton ordered the quiet late-night arrest of a seemingly harmless quartermaster, a man whose easy access to Washington's schedule had made him the perfect internal mole. The discovery sent a tremor of shock through the general's staff, confirming that treason was not merely an external threat, but one woven into the fabric of their own command. The ambush is sprung. Miles away, near the cold, damped stretch of the Peekskill Road, the British ambush force was in position. Hidden among the rocks and dense thicket, the elite scout regiments, including those wearing the watchcoats Mulligan had been forced to sew, waited in disciplined silence. They were tense, confident, and prepared to seize the most valuable prize in North America. The ambush was designed to be swift and overwhelming. As the light grew, they heard the sounds of horsebacks and the creaking of wagon wheels. This was it. The trap was set. When the small decoy column finally entered the designated kill zone, the British sprang the trap with brutal efficiency. Musket fire erupted from the woods, followed by a charge intended to capture the American commander. However, the British realized immediately that something was wrong. The American party was small, consisting mainly of supply wagons and rearguard soldiers, not the imposing entourage of the commander-in-chief. The officers, frustrated and confused, pressed the attack, quickly scattering the decoy party. The ensuing skirmish was short, bloody, and pointless. The British had risked a major deployment, exposed their positions, and failed to achieve their primary war-ending objective. Their prize was a few supply wagons and a handful of captured soldiers who, under interrogation, provided no information on Washington's whereabouts, confirming only that the general had abruptly altered his travel plans late the previous night. The strategic aftermath. The news of the failure reached Major General Clinton in New York with a sting of bitter disappointment. The intelligence had been flawless. The execution had been meticulously planned. The only variable was the target's movement. Washington had vanished. The aborted ambush had immediate and profound consequences. The saving of the revolution. By simply not being where the British expected him, Washington secured his leadership. Had he been captured, the Continental Army's early collapse was virtually guaranteed. His survival allowed the momentum, however shaky, to continue through the critical campaigns of the following year. The exposure of the network. The failure forced the British command to immediately question the security of their intelligence apparatus in New York. The subsequent interrogation of the ambush participants revealed the abrupt change in American plans, pointing directly to a high-level leak. The incident caused a flurry of arrests and suspicion throughout the British officer corps, sowing distrust that hampered future operations. The confirmation of espionage. For Washington and Hamilton, the successful evasion served as the ultimate proof of the value of Mulligan's and Cato's network. The accuracy of the warning, down to the very hour, elevated Mulligan's intelligence from useful gossip to critical, life-saving information. This single event ensured the continued, high-priority funding and protection of the New York spy ring, which would later become even more critical to the war effort. Cato, resting in a corner of the farmhouse kitchen, was quietly debriefed by Hamilton before being smuggled back toward the river under a new, more safe pretext. He had watched the intensity of the command staff, had seen the fear and then the profound relief, now had a chance to fight another day, all thanks to a whispered conversation overheard by a man the enemy considered too insignificant to notice. The war finally ended in 1783. General George Washington, riding back into New York City following the British evacuation, famously made a point of stopping his carriage. His destination was not the lavish quarters of the victorious generals, but the humble storefront on Queen Street. He dismounted and, in a profound gesture of public gratitude, went inside to embrace Hercules Mulligan. The scene was a public affirmation of Mulligan's heroic, perilous service. The tailor, who had risked the gallows daily as Washington's premier spy, was now fully vindicated. His treason was transformed into patriotism. His house, once a nest of British officers, was now a sanctuary of the new republic. Mulligan's return to civilian life was marked by immediate prosperity and honor. Washington and Hamilton remained lifelong friends and patrons. Mulligan was a successful merchant, an affluent member of the burgeoning New York elite, and a proud citizen of the free nation he had risked everything to save. His tale was celebrated, recounted in taverns and drawing rooms, the dashing, charming spy who kept the commander-in-chief safe. He lived a long, prosperous life, achieving the ultimate American dream, the freedom to be remembered, honored, and wealthy. His legacy was secure, etched into the foundational myths of the Republic. The return to the kitchen. In stark, agonizing contrast, the story of Cato almost instantly faded into the shadows. After successfully delivering the life-saving intelligence, Cato was smuggled back across the Hudson, returning to the Mulligan household not as a hero, but as a returned piece of property. He resumed his routine, silent life in the kitchen. He returned to the meticulous, fragrant work of grinding cacao, his hands bearing the calluses of the oars, not the glory of a patriot. The irony was a perpetual, heavy cloak. Cato had risked death, not merely for a political ideal, but for the fundamental hope that Washington's victory might eventually translate into his personal emancipation. Yet the new republic, founded on the immortal words "all men are created equal," refused to extend that equality to men of Cato's complexion. While Mulligan celebrated liberty's triumph, Cato continued to serve him, his heroism rendered invisible by the very racial hierarchy the war had done little to dismantle in New York. There was no public recognition, no medal, no testimonial, only the renewed, grinding certainty of servitude. To have revealed his role in saving Washington would have been dangerous, inviting questioning that could expose the spy network's vulnerabilities. To the new nation, he was a nameless, faceless background figure, a detail in the wealthy tailor's successful home. The nation's unpaid debt. Cato's story is not unique. It is tragically representative of the thousands of black patriots, both enslaved and free, who fought, spied, and died for the American cause. Black soldiers endured the most dangerous combat conditions, often promised freedom that was rarely delivered. Black spies and couriers provided intelligence that preserved critical moments of the war, yet they received no protection or recognition post-war. The central failure of the newly independent United States was its inability to reconcile its foundational rhetoric with its economic reality. The promise of liberty and justice for all was structurally undercut by the lucrative institution of slavery, particularly in the South, but also in the North, where gradual abolition was often slow and incomplete. For men like Cato, the victory meant that their masters were no longer the British, but white Americans, men who, despite fighting a war against tyranny, were fiercely protective of their right to own human beings. The memory of Cato's courage, the long, perilous row across the Hudson in the freezing dark, was intentionally erased from the official narrative. It was inconvenient history. The nation preferred to focus on white heroic figures. The inclusion of an enslaved man's life-saving contribution would have forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the nation's deepest moral stain: the fragmented trail to freedom. The true fate of Cato remains historically fragmented and obscured. Did Mulligan, his friend and former co-conspirator, ever free him? Historical records suggest that Mulligan, as a member of the Manumission Society, did eventually free several enslaved individuals, though the exact timeline and details regarding Cato are often lost in the bureaucratic records of the era. If Cato was eventually granted freedom, it would not have been a celebratory liberation based on his wartime service, but a gradual manumission, a legal document granted years after the victory he helped secure, often requiring him to prove he could support himself. His freedom, if it came, was a hard-won condition of legal status, not a triumphant recognition of his patriotism. He likely lived out his life as a free black man in New York, facing the harsh realities of a city still deeply segregated and prejudiced. He would have faced lower wages, restricted movement, and the constant threat of being kidnapped and sold south. His legacy was carried not on bronze plaques or in history books, but in the quiet shared memory of the few who knew the true story. The selective memory of a nation. The story of the enslaved courier and the captured secret stands as a powerful indictment of American history's selective memory. The nation needed heroes, and it chose to remember the tailor who spoke English and shared drinks with Washington. It chose to forget the man who risked his life based on the whispered information he gathered while preparing chocolate, a man whose heroism was rooted in his ability to be ignored. The final irony is this: Hercules Mulligan became a legend, a symbol of the cost of American freedom. But Cato's story illustrates the far greater, more enduring cost of American hypocrisy. He paid his debt to the revolution with his life's risk, yet the nation refused to pay his debt, the simple debt of dignity and immediate freedom. Cato's journey across the Hudson was the ultimate act of faith in a promise that was not yet ready to be kept. His true monument is not a statue, but the enduring question his memory poses: for whom was the American Revolution truly fought, and whose service was deemed too inconvenient to remember? The sweet victory of independence was built in part on the bitter, unacknowledged sacrifice of those like Cato, who ensured the survival of a nation that initially refused to acknowledge their humanity.